Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to this very special edition of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, or DEI conversations, held in conjunction with International Women's Day 2023, themed Embrace Equity. It's amazing how we have close to 500 participants today from the length and breadth of corporate Malaysia. My name is Farah, and I'm the Managing Director and Chief Communications Officer of Fusang Digital Securities Exchange. I'm also a member of the 30% Club's board mentoring scheme. As you might know, the 30% Club is a global movement with the sole aim of increasing female representation at board and executive level to, as the name suggests, 30%. For me anyway, personally, diversity, equity and inclusion in any shape or form is the elixir of life. And this special edition of the DEI series, is brought to us thanks to the support of the Securities Commission, Bursa Malaysia, Minority Shareholders Watch Group, Institute of Corporate Directors Malaysia, and Lead Women. So thank you for this special edition. It gives me great pleasure to now invite Dr. Amy Moris, Chair of 30% Club Malaysia and Advisor, Business and Sustainability Maybank, and former CEO of Maybank Investment Banking Group, to deliver her welcome remarks and moderate our first panel. Amy, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Farah. Let me begin by sharing a very quick story. After an inspired lunch recently with Professor Elizabeth, the CEO of Sunway University, on how entrenched gender biases are, I went home and I asked my two teenage sons to draw a doctor. Much to my dismay, particularly as the 30% Club chair, they both drew distinctively male doctor images. Ladies and gentlemen, gender diversity, equity, and inclusion have indeed come a long way, with a long way yet to go. But let's look at the facts. A study by the Harvard Business Review indicates that diverse companies are 70% more likely to capture new markets. According to McKinsey, companies in which the executive teams are diverse, they are as much as 25% more likely to generate greater profits than companies that lack diversity within their executive teams. And adding our own Malaysian data into the equation, I think you saw it also on the video, from a report by the Institute of Corporate Directors Malaysia, showed that boards of listed companies on Bursa with at least 1/3 women representation correlate with 38% higher return on equity, or ROE, than boards with no women representation. So the business case for DEI is very clear. On this eve of International Women's Day 2023, what I would like to begin with is to spend a minute to unpack diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, and more specifically, the E of DEI. This year's 2023 theme of Embrace Equity is to really get the world to talk about why equal opportunities are no longer enough and can in fact be exclusionary rather than inclusive. So, what's the difference between equity and equality? Equality means everybody having the same thing. Equity, on the other hand, means everybody having what they need. So let's have a look at what the difference is in terms of bikes. So I love this visualization, right? So if you can see that, equality does not equal equity. Equality would mean, if you look again at this representation, it would mean that everyone gets the same bike. But as we can see, not everyone can ride the same bike to get to where they want to go. Equity, on the other hand, means, if you look at the lower picture, means everyone gets a bike that enables them to get to where they want to go. Equity can then be defined as giving everyone what they need to be successful. It's not giving everyone the same thing. It's about giving everyone, it's not about giving everyone the exact same thing, expecting that will make people equal, because it assumes that everyone started out in the same place. And this can be vastly inaccurate because everyone isn't the same. So equity acknowledges that people don't begin life in the same place and that circumstances can make it more difficult for people to achieve the same goals. The goal of equity is to change systemic and structural barriers that get in the way of people's ability to thrive. So that's the framing for Embrace Equity, the International Women's Day theme for this year. So let's get the conversation going with two very strong male allies of the 30% Club. We have here today with us Dr. Kishore Ravuri. He is the co-founder of CEO Action Network and head of sustainability of Dutch Lady Milk Industries. And we also have Khoo Jia Yao, lawyer partner at Q&Co, as well as co-chair of Malaysian CSO-SDG Alliance. But before we get into the meat of the conversation, let me just highlight, in terms of talking about diversity, there are many shapes and forms of diversity that cover demographics, such as age, race, social background, and there's also cognitive diversity that encompasses learning orientations, approaches, and ideas. For our conversation today with both Kishore and Jayal, there will be a bias towards gender DEI, and it will target to answer three things. Firstly, why? Why has the E of DEI been less loved or less focused on? Secondly, is the how. How can equity, which is driving the greater understanding of needs in organizations, be activated? And thirdly is the who. Who needs to be fully invested in this structural and systematic activation of what I like to call the unpacking of DEI. So let me begin with Jayal. Jayal, some organizations use the nomenclature of D and I, diversity and inclusion, and don't include the E or equity. So is there any specific reason for this? Why does it feel like sometimes the E or equity is less loved?
Hi, Amy, and such a pleasure to be here, and hello, everyone. I think the issue with nomenclature, so I'm not an authority on this, and I've done my research in terms of the origins of these terms, and it's just quite hard to actually. But here's my experience in terms of in the ESG, sustainability, and before this CSR space. I think these are all evolutions, and these are all evolutions in terms of society's expectations and how concepts and frameworks of thinking have traction, and sometimes in some sectors more powerful than others. And so we have been hearing D&I, and then now I feel more recently DEI. But yes, I think the E could be said to be implied under the I aspect and inclusion, but I think it's also very powerful when we actually articulate the importance of equity in this term, DEI.
Yeah, and just to add as well, Jayal, we also, like you sort of say, you pointed out that it's about the evolution. Now it's not just DEI. Many organizations are talking about DEIB or DEBI, calling it Debbie, and the B standing for belonging. So Kishore, as head of sustainability of a PLC, how are you emphasizing equity, for example, at Dutch Lady?
Okay, thank you for that. My pleasure being here. I would also like to just add on to what Gio said. It is also less loved because it is also less understood compared to diversity and inclusion as concepts. So there are two types of organizations, one with very genuinely with low awareness on what equity means for the organization. So they tend to lose their perspective on the aspect of equity. And those who understand equity, they dismiss it very conveniently because it's a very tedious and sometimes being called as nice to have exercise, purely because they see it as a disadvantage to the power position of organizations from where we tend to operate, where I would go as far as to the extent of saying that we operate to exploit people and people relationships under the guise of standard policies and procedures. And the moment you have standard policies and procedures, inherent biases and discrimination tend to exist. Anyway, so that's my take on why it's less loved. But as head of sustainability at Dutch Lady, equity is part of how we define sustainability. So our definition of sustainability for business rests on two principles: efficiency and equity. So at the risk of oversimplifying it, how we define equity for a start is to make things better than they are today for the benefit of both our current and future people. And better here by definition could be evolving from one generation of our employees or suppliers to another generation of our stakeholders. And this is where the job gets difficult, but we are working towards it. And our focus right now is on psychological safety of our people, where they have the benefit of safe and secure space where they can give voice to their dilemmas, their issues without fear of judgment or retribution. And that's a starting step towards building equitable teams.
So, but, I love what you've said. So where would be the most significant gaps, or perhaps the focal areas within organizations to actually reflect and activate their commitment to mainstreaming DEI?
Okay, I would like to cite a good example here, and I would like to bring up the issue of what we know as carbon tunnel syndrome, where due to various reasons such as institutional pressure, stronger business case for sectors with high climate risk, and sometimes for the reason of vanity or just flavor or fashion of the season, people tend to focus a lot on the environment, ignoring the DEI component. And the biggest gap even then is the failure to recognize how climate strategies and mitigation kind of impact people and communities in the value chain, and examining that issue with DEI lens. And the gap here is DEI lens is not gender lens. And that's a basic fundamental error in application. It is about ensuring different people with different means in the society are included in decisions that would affect their lives and their livelihoods. And the failure to do so out of either by ignorance or by design takes the much needed focus away from DEI in my perspective.
Jaya, anything that in particular that you've seen where in terms of being able to wear the DEI lens in terms of your CSO and your SDG alliance work?
I think one of the biggest gaps that I keep encountering, if we're talking about the forgetfulness about the E or the neglect of E, I think it's the taboo around equity, is the anxiety around the E, because organizations lack the essential components to actually start embracing E. Because by definition of the E in the DEI, it is down to the particular individual's needs. I love your bike illustration, right? Because it gets down to that. And so from the top to right down to the individual person within a large organizations, especially, what you need to do is you need to trust your intermediary managers to actually devise context-appropriate interventions. And you need to trust people to do that. And when you know that they don't have important components and capacities to do that, you're gonna steer clear from that, because you know it's gonna be disastrous. Because when you open up for, when you say, borrowing from what Kishore said, when you loosen up that exploitative system, that system that is well oiled for efficiency, when you loosen up its margins, you're very afraid about the noise and chatter that's going to come out from the ground, because you don't have the capacity to deal and respond to the diverse noise that you're going to get. So I think that taboo, that anxiety needs to be addressed. And those capacities are not about understanding climate change and understanding net zero. They are much more fundamental before we get to these kinds of very, how do I say, solution-orientated interventions, like, we're contributing to carbon emissions, let's fix it, So it is it requires a different kind of program and understanding and philosophical change within the organization.
I guess to go back to what Kishore said, loosening the exploitative aspects, right? So we have one question here in the chat box. Are there any Malaysian laws that mandate aspects of DEI in corporations?
No, no law is phrased in the language of DE&I, but we do have laws against discrimination. This is actually in our federal constitution, in Article 8. And so there is a strong foundational framework for fairness and for equity, whether in the public sector, whether in administrative government decision-making, but also in increasingly the way the judiciary, our courts, have been interpreting these laws, increasingly in private sector organizations as well. But no explicit laws. There are explicit laws on employment, so we are making progress in that. We see progress in terms of maternity leave and protection around and empowering people to have more flexibility in their work arrangements. These things are progressing. So, but not in DEI specifically, not in those terms.
Okay, so maybe if not in terms of laws and policies, let's look at practice, right? I've been in so many conversations where people really are trying to focus when we talk about DEI or gender DEI. The most typical conversation is that, oh, hiring and promotions must be based purely on merit, right? So I'm sure that both you, Kishore and Jayal, you have many views on this. I think we have, everyone, every boardroom and everything's debated this greatly. My question for both of you, maybe I'll start with Kishore, is that how do we take a DEI lens, right, to unpack this normative statement that, oh, hiring and promotions must be based purely on merit?
As I see it, merit in itself is not an issue. In fact, merit should always be a precondition as long as you define what constitutes merit. And I go back to what Gio was saying, that there is a foundational law for everything under the sun, including equity and fairness. But how we define equity and fairness, similar to how we define merit, is very, very important. I can quickly cite an example. I can say a candidate is meritorious if he or she has, let's say, 4 qualities: the right set of values, probably demonstrated leadership or leadership potential, and maybe Ivy League qualifications and relevant experience. But if a candidate just meets the first 2, I would say the hiring is still based on merit. But putting your DEI lens or applying DEI criteria doesn't necessarily mean that you have to hire people because they are disadvantaged. The thumb rule, in my opinion, is to look at 3 key things. One is know the demographics of people and communities in your business ecosystem, including their differences and which tend to become their disadvantages. Second is know how those people and communities are impacted in your value chain so that you're able to prioritize. And then also the third part is know how such people and communities can actually benefit from and grow with your business. And that's where this is whole the equity part.
Yeah.
Okay, I would say that response. Jaya?
So I would say there are 2 parts. The first part, I would just want to get it out of the way first, which is we have to work against tokenistic, performative type of diversity and inclusion, or diversity. Just hiring someone just to fill up that tokenistic color or gender. Because when you do that, then you're going to get a reaction from others who would say, then this is not according to merits. So with that out of the way, because we want to focus on the spirit of DEI, with that out of the way, building on what Kish has mentioned, it's about expanding and unpacking what we mean when we say merits. So that having a broader perspective. So imagining a dashboard, right? So if we just have what is the academic achievement, what is the university ranking of that person, what's the stability of this person in terms of holding a job, and what are these typical academic achievements and corporate ladder this person has done. And then the other thing about is watching out for the demerits that happen, which is the unbiased and which is the unconscious bias that happens while reading these that dashboard. Now, having we still have to operate on merits. That's on logic, on merits, and we have to be aligned with the purpose of the organization. So it's about it, and in the context of DE and I, it's about expanding the dashboard to read in higher definition in that sense. And the organization, the employer who can do that better is going to be more competitive.
I love that. Looking at pictures in high res, basically, correct? The one thing is that, Kishore, when you said, in terms of contextualizing, right, making sure that you have the data to contextualize the needs of your organization, the needs of the industry, the needs of the ecosystem, in order to really understand what is merit and what is merit beyond competencies, that, in order for us to be able to encompass different leadership styles, different cognitive diversity, orientations, and etc. So it does sometimes seem, right, that there's just so much to get done. And, it almost seems like, like what you said, Jaya, it's like if we don't start, then we don't have to address the level of investments needed, how much resourcing, the unpacking really does require. It's almost like being back in Malaysia in 2015, when any suggestion of hiring a chief sustainability officer would be like, meet with a lot of eyeball rolling in the boardroom. So now I think that the experience in Asia Pac certainly is that there's a growing numbers of people who are now taking on the role of chief DEI officer, for example. So with this kind of sense that there's just so much to get done, what would you say are practical suggestions and advice, to specific industries, to your specific industry, and to public at general? Kishore, maybe I'll start with you.
Yes, so I'm going to go back to my earlier response, where I can't emphasize enough on the need to define diversity, define equity, and define inclusion in the context of your business first. What it means to people who matter to you, and what are the DEI issues and concerns that matter to the people who matter to you. And then the next step is to identify how these specific issues are actually affecting or will potentially affect people and their motivation to continue to contribute their best to your business. And of course, the last step would be to design programs and track issues resolution and report aggregate impact. And I can give a very quick example. So recently I was part of this DEI discussions on what to prioritize for International Women's Day as a topic. And this is an organization where, let's say, 80% of their employee workforce are millennials. And we are talking about gender representation as a topic. And all of a sudden, someone brought it up that actually, when we go and talk to these millennials, the issues around DEI are very different. They want to talk about DEI in the digital space and the issues of DEI as represented in the DEI space. So I think that's why it's so important to define what diversity, equity, and inclusion, all the three aspects are very different in the context of individual business and the stakeholders who actually matter to us, as opposed to going and adopting any ad hoc group of people or group of issues to address as a business.
Yes, I think that you have to be guided by the contours of your own organization. And so, because it has to be contextual. It is not an abstract problem, yeah. and then requiring an abstract conceptual solution that you pluck from out there. So the context is where you have to pick up from somewhere, whether you're starting from your human resources department, whether you're starting from your human rights department, or your legal department, compliance department, health and safety department. You start somewhere. Best is you start from the top. And it has to be contextual. And by that, I think, is recognizing that the challenge of DEI by design is a subjective one. And so if you're going to do equity well, if you're going to start performing in taking action on equity, it's about looking inwards and then identifying the gaps and working it from that. So it requires taking ownership. That's a key word that often is missing. It's not something that you assign a manager to work on, while at the top, it's business as usual.
Yeah, I think the responses that both of you gave kind of addressed one of the questions we have in the chat box. It says that given the lack of capacity and fear of chatter and noise, what advice would you give for companies to embrace the E? Essentially, what both of you are saying is that you start off with your own data, correct? You invest in your own data. You understand yourself as an organization, and you build from there. Because, like Kishore says, if your organization, where it's overwhelmingly of millennials and Gen Zs, you have to understand what DE&I means for them, which is largely related to the digital space. So yes, and when we talk about unpacking DEI, getting structured and systematic, from top down to the bottom, right? And bringing the whole of the organization to the table, right? The other aspect that, which I have really kind of, spent a lot of time talking to various groups on is the resultant power of norms. Right? We are all shaped, our stereotypes, our gender perceptions are all, in terms of what we see as norms, role models. So what do you think are the power of new norms? How can, we shape social behavior and expectations? Similarly, in a successful way, as we have all internalized how we behave in a library. We all know what the expectations are, what the clear do's and don'ts are. And so how could that be reflected and actualized, in the modern corporate world, right? In a progressive modern world?
Yeah. Maybe I'll go first this time, Kishore. So I think, and then, because I'm going to attempt at talking about, earlier I talked about why don't we do E? And why don't we see people doing E as much as well? And I spoke about the anxiety. And I think to answer your question, Amy, I think the antidote to that is, what is the new norm? Is, let's talk about what is the current norm. The current norm, if I could be reductive, is one of mutual mistrust, right? So if I'm building on, just taking what Kish mentioned earlier, it feels profoundly exploitative. It feels there is a mistrust. It feels that the relationship, and when we talk about DEI, we are talking about improving the quality of relationships. And we feel that, and so the status quo is that the relationship is a two-dimensional one, is one that is a very thin value, in which I turn up to work, you pay me on time, and then I'll try to do as little work as possible, and you try to pay me as little as possible. If that's the value conversation that you're having, then the possibilities are very, very finite, very limited, right? So possibilities around innovation, possibilities around making the workplace more healthy, more encouraging, more nurturing, where more things are possible. So we want to, how do we turn that, if that's the current situation, how do we turn that around? I will say is having faith in people. It starts from here. And I don't say this facetiously, having faith in people, because on the framework that we are on the pursuit on DEI, because we understand that the basis that our humanity is intertwined. And we don't want to do, right? So first thing is, we don't want to do harm as part of our business. That's what we all agree on, right? And in terms of our progress, we don't want to leave anyone behind if they have the merits. So I talked about that. And so we don't want people to leave the bus or get thrown under the bus for the wrong reasons, right? So, and we want to get that right. So I think having faith in people is key. And how do you translate that? And so faith is believing that people have the inherent worth, and we need to expand the resolution that we have and the things that we have on our dashboards in terms of looking at their faith, at the value, and also having that bandwidth to appreciate and value people on a broader spectrum of metrics, let's just say.
So Kishore, yeah. So how would you develop that real high res, so to speak, of more depth to the resolutions of humanity?
I really like your analogy of, we all know how to behave in a library, but we do not necessarily do what we are supposed to do in a library, and that's the reality. So breaking systemic inequities is not an overnight phenomenon. What can be achieved overnight, however, is an organization and its leadership acknowledging that there are systemic issues that exist. And these issues could be in the form of your standard, archaic, obsolete policies and procedures, one rule for everyone kind of an approach, and the need to critically examine those using a DEI lens. And that's the starting step. And the biggest challenge for organization, all the organizations that I have been working with, has also been the fear of organizations to leave or let go their power position or their power of negotiation with their people the moment they start looking at equity as something that they want to embed within their organization. So organizations need to give up that fear and move to a position where they're saying that we want to create a win-win culture, a symbiotic relationship with people on whom we depend on to run our business. And hence, it's not about operating from a power position. It's not about retaining that power of negotiation with people under the guise of standard policies and procedures, but you ensure that what you're creating benefits both them and the organization. So that's
So what
the
would you,
shift that we need to see.
and what would your appeal be to leadership, whether it's boardroom or senior management teams?
Well, it's a tough one. I mean, I've been talking about the equity and DEI part and defining it for the boards and CEOs for many years now. It's being currently seen as nice to have, and my only appeal is to give it the importance and focus that it deserves, because as we move in the next 5 to 6 years, I think activism on DEI will be at its peak. Civil society will start talking about it. Employees will start talking about it. And organizations and leadership who do not move fast enough will definitely have serious consequences in terms of higher turnover on people, lack of trust, lack of motivation, enough motivation for people to continue to see their growth align with the organization's growth.
Jaya, any specific appeal?
I think if it's specific appeal to the people on top, then it's really on the norm aspect. I think this is a journey of transformation, right? And so it's not just a journey, i.e. entity A moves from point A to point B and it is still entity A. This is a journey in which you are aware that you are transforming and you are going to embrace that transformation. It is a very powerful transformation. So it's like the riddle of the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. So it's not a question of how much gold is actually there. Is it going to be worth the journey? That's the wrong question. The question is to commit to that journey, understanding that it's a transformative journey. And as you commit to that and you take actions from where you are contextually, then you're going to start to discover things about yourself. So the process of discovery isn't a process of managing. You don't manage discovery. It's a discovery is a mindset, right? So the curiosity and earnestness and a readiness to, and that preparing that wider bandwidth for noise, chatter, surprises, those things that we talked about. And then slowly building the muscle to cope with, because you're going to encounter and you're going to welcome critique, disagreement, dissent, and other questionings of decisions, for example, because you're going to get into the nuts and bolts in terms of equity, in terms of your decision-making on pay, decision-making on why this person can do this and not that, etc. You need to, that ability to engage in a broader, more higher resolution with different segments of people, all that's going to give rise to this. So as you go through this, I call it the negotiating and the struggling, and you get good at it, and you develop that muscle to struggle constructively within, right? And then you realize, oh, we're getting stronger and we're getting to know our people much better. Before we saw them as a two-dimensional person, where we made sense of them in a very narrow way. Now we understand that there are more facets to them. And that opens up the possibility that I talked about. And that overall, you start and you're realizing that you're discovering the gold is where you are, not at the end of the rainbow, because the goal is right where you are. But it's because you have transformed that you are now able to access some of this gold. I think that requires faith, right? Which is acting without evidence. Because if in a traditional mindset, you look at the evidence and you go, look at these people exploiting their maternity leave. Look at these people exploiting work from home, right? That's evidence for us to tighten the screws. So having that faith and getting on this transformative journey.
I couldn't, that is just very, very detailed. I get that whole, I get the texture, and I get, I'm able to visualize. So that's really awesome. I think we have one question which is worth picking up, which is, I think Kishore, you did mention about DEI in the digital space. So the question is, how is DEI in the digital space different from a brick and mortar business, for example?
It's how much credence is being given to women, for example, on the gender side, and whether DEI issues are being represented and talked in the right scope, context, and for the results that it could generate. I think that's one of the biggest things in the DEI space. So the issues are the same, but it's just that in the digital space, there could be the shape and form of the issues, or how far the issues, the implications of those issues may not be as far reaching as in a brick and mortar business. Yeah, because here you're talking about people who live and breathe with you, who sit next to you, and they're all affected. And when they are affected, it kind of takes a very it has a snowball effect on everything that's happening in the organization, including the purpose and culture. But in the online space, that can be contained to some extent, but it also shapes the narrative and context and what DEI should actually mean and should achieve for organizations. So to summarize, I think the issues are the same, but in terms of the implications and how far-reaching they could be, I think there's a little bit of a difference between the digital and the brick and mortar space.
Okay, I guess we could discuss, for a lot longer, but I know that the panel for session 2 is already here. So, but as we wrap, right, and before I hand over to Farah, let me leave everyone with this, that in order to achieve gender DEI, we must first unpack gender equity, which both Kishore and Jayal have, very in articulate fashion done so. And just to leave everyone with the recall on the difference between equity and equality. So equality means each individual or group is given the same resources or opportunities. Equity, on the other hand, recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to level the playing field. So Kishore and Jayal, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Great conversation. And thank you, of course, for being great male allies and advocates of the 30% Club. And back over to you, Farah.